Staff Sergeant Mentuani. Victor Hayes smiled as he submitted the convoy route. He had just handed 25 American soldiers to the enemy. He knew exactly what waited inside Black Eagle Pass. He knew the angles. He knew the timing. He had sold every detail for money, and he felt nothing. Not guilt, not hesitation, just satisfaction. If you believe that betrayal from within is the most unforgivable act a soldier can commit, drop your city in the comments below. Subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because what happened next inside that canyon is something nobody saw coming. Nobody except one quiet woman who had been hiding the most extraordinary secret in the entire United States Army. She sat in the back of the 3rd Humvee with her headset on and her eyes closed, and if you had looked at her for the first time, you would have thought she was sleeping. She was not sleeping. Specialist Emily Carter never slept on convoy days. She listened. She calculated. She ran scenarios through her mind the way other people run grocery lists automatically, quietly, without anyone around her having any idea what was happening behind those closed eyes and that perfectly still expression. 28 years old, blonde hair pulled back tight under her helmet, 5'6", 132 pounds, assigned to communications, invisible by design. That was the word people used when they talked about Emily Carter. On the rare occasions they talked about Emily Carter at all. Invisible. She made herself that way. She had spent 6 years in the United States Army perfecting the art of being the person no one looked at twice. She answered questions directly and said nothing extra. She fixed radios faster than anyone else in the unit and never mentioned it. She filed her reports on time. She showed up early and left late. She caused no problems and created no waves and drew no attention to herself. And that was exactly the way she wanted it. Because Emily Carter was hiding something. She had been hiding it since the day she enlisted. She had been hiding it since the day her father died. His name was Robert Carter, and before pancreatic cancer took him at 59 years old, he was considered one of the most gifted civilian long-range marksmen in the entire Western United States. Not military, never military, but the kind of man who understood ballistics the way musicians understand rhythm, not as a formula to be memorized, but as a language spoken fluently, naturally from somewhere deep in the bone. Robert Carter had started teaching Emily when she was 7 years old. Not because he wanted a protege, not because he had any grand plan for her future. He taught her because she asked. Because one afternoon she walked out to his workshop behind the house in Billings, Montana, and she looked at the equipment on the bench and she asked him what it all meant. And he looked at her face and he saw something there that made him pull up a chair. He taught her everything. How to read wind before it moves the grass. How to calculate bullet drop across distances most people cannot even see with the naked eye. How to be patient, not just physically, but mentally. How to empty the mind of everything except the single moment that matters. How to study terrain, not as geography, but as a conversation between the land and anyone trying to move through it. How to recognize a kill zone from a kilometer away by looking at the geometry of the hills. By the time Emily was 14, she was shooting groups at 800 meters that made grown men go quiet. By the time she was 18, her father told her something he had never told anyone. "Emily," he said one afternoon when the light was going gold across the Montana hills and the air smelled like pine and distant rain, "you are the most naturally gifted shooter I have ever seen in my life, and I have seen a lot of shooters." She told her mother that night, and her mother looked at her with eyes that were proud and frightened at the same time, and she said something that Emily had never forgotten. "Promise me you will never use that gift to hurt someone." Emily promised. She meant it when she made it. She kept meaning it for 6 years. She joined the Army at 22, not because she wanted to fight, but because she wanted to serve. She chose communications deliberately, a specialty that kept her in support roles, away from direct combat, far from any situation where the promise to her mother might become complicated. She was excellent at it, genuinely excellent. She had an ear for signals the way she had an eye for distance, and her unit's radio systems functioned at a level that her superiors noticed without understanding why. But she never told anyone about her father. She never told anyone about the training, and she never told anyone about the rifle. It was her father's custom precision rifle built by his own hands, over 3 years modified and refined and tested until it was as close to perfect as any firearm Emily had ever seen. He had left it to her when he died. She had stored it for 2 years before she finally brought it with her on deployment. She did not know why she brought it. She told herself it was sentimental. She told herself she would never take it out of the case. She had carried it hidden beneath her communications equipment for 4 months without anyone noticing, because nobody noticed Emily Carter. That was the arrangement. That was the deal she had made with herself and with her mother and with the version of the world where she was just the radio girl and nothing else would ever be required of her. Captain Ryan Walker stood at the front of the briefing room that morning, and he was the kind of officer who filled a room without trying. Broad shoulders, direct eyes, the voice of a man who had never once questioned his own authority because he had never had to. He ran good briefings, organized, clear, efficient. His soldiers trusted him, and they had good reasons to trust him, and Emily respected him even from her permanent position at the back of every room. She had the topographic map of Black Eagle Pass in her lap. She had been studying it for 11 minutes. Captain Walker was explaining the route, the timing, the vehicle order, the communication protocols, the estimated transit time through the pass, and his voice was confident and professional. And Emily was not hearing a single word of it because her entire mind was occupied by what she was seeing on the map in front of her. Black Eagle Pass. A narrow canyon cut through the Beartooth Mountains 200 meters wide at its broadest point and barely 60 meters wide at its narrowest. Sheer granite walls on both sides rising to ridgelines that sat at approximately 45 degrees of elevation above the canyon floor. 3 natural choke points where the road curved blind. 2 shallow depressions on the north side that would look like cover from ground level, but were completely exposed from the southern ridge. A single entrance and a single exit separated by 4 kilometers of road with no lateral escape routes. Emily's father had walked her through terrain like this when she was 10 years old. "Baby girl," he had said, standing on a hillside in Montana with a topographic map in his hand and the morning sun behind him. You look at any piece of ground and you ask yourself one question first. Not where would I hide? Ask yourself, where would I put the gun to make everything inside that space impossible to survive? You find that answer first. Then you plan around it. Emily had found the answer. She found it in 11 minutes looking at a map. There were 3 positions on the ridgelines of Black Eagle Pass from which a skilled sniper team could cover every single meter of that canyon road simultaneously. 3 positions that overlapped their fields of fire so completely that there was no angle of approach, no piece of cover, no depression or rock formation anywhere on that canyon floor that would provide protection from all 3 simultaneously. It was not just a narrow road through the mountains. It was a trap. It was the most perfectly designed ambush geography Emily Carter had ever seen in her life, including anything her father had ever shown her in training. And Captain Walker was about to drive 25 soldiers directly into it. She almost said something. She almost stood up right there in the briefing room with the topographic map in her hands, and she almost interrupted Captain Walker mid-sentence, and she almost said what she could see so clearly it felt like the canyon walls were right there in the room with them. She almost did it. And then she looked around at the faces of the soldiers in that room. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, who had served 3 combat tours and had 17 commendations on his record, sitting with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on Walker with complete professional confidence. Sergeant First Class Daniel Reeves, 12 years in the Army, who had run more convoy operations than Emily had been alive, nodding along with the briefing with the calm certainty of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Private First Class Jake Morrison, 21 years old and 6 months into his first deployment, taking notes in a small green notebook with the focused earnestness of someone who genuinely believed that paying attention in the briefing was the most important thing he could do. All of them looking at Captain Walker. None of them looking at her. She was the comms girl. She was the radio specialist. She was the quiet blonde woman in the back of the room who made sure the radios worked and who nobody had ever seen do anything except exactly that. And in that moment, in that briefing room, with the topographic map of a death trap in her lap and 25 lives balanced on the edge of the decision she could not bring herself to make, Emily Carter heard her mother's voice. "Promise me." She closed the map. She didn't say a word. The convoy rolled out before sunrise. 12 vehicles, 2 gun trucks at the front, 2 gun trucks at the rear, 8 cargo vehicles in between. 1 communications vehicle, hers positioned at the 3rd slot from the front because that was standard protocol for her role and because nobody thought twice about where they put the radio girl. Emily sat in the back of her vehicle with her headset on and her eyes opened this time, watching the darkness outside the window turn from black to gray to the pale cold blue of a Montana mountain dawn. The road climbed steadily as they moved northeast, switchbacking up through pine forest, and then out above the tree line into the open rocky terrain that preceded the pass. She had the map on her knee. She kept looking at it even though she had already memorized every feature. Sergeant First Class Reeves was in the front seat navigating. Private Morrison was driving. Neither of them spoke much. The radio channels were quiet. The convoy moved in the tight professional intervals that Walker had specified in the briefing. Emily watched the hills. She watched the way the terrain changed as they climbed, the way the granite formations began to appear, the way the road narrowed, the way the walls of the canyon began to rise on either side until they blocked out the sky and the whole world compressed into a long gray ribbon of road between vertical stone. 30 minutes after sunrise, they entered Black Eagle Pass, and everything went quiet. That was the thing nobody ever talked about afterward in all the briefings and debriefs and official reports. The quiet, how before the first shot, before any of it, there was this absolute complete silence that fell over the canyon like a held breath. The wind stopped. The birds there had been birds in the pines on the approach road were gone. The only sounds were the engines of 12 vehicles echoing off stone walls. Emily had her headset off. She was already reaching under the bench seat for the rifle case, not because she had decided to use it. She told herself she hadn't decided anything. She just wanted it closer. The first shot hit the lead vehicle's windshield at 0607 hours and 2 seconds. Emily knew the angle before the echo finished rolling across the canyon. Northern Ridge, eastern position, approximately 850 meters, elevated 43 degrees above the canyon floor. She knew it because she had predicted it on the map 12 hours ago, and the universe had confirmed her prediction with a bullet. The convoy erupted. 12 vehicles braking hard, soldiers pouring out of doors, radio traffic exploding across every channel simultaneously, Walker's voice cutting through the noise with the trained authority of a man who had trained for this calling positions, calling for air support, calling for defensive formations. The answers came back in fragments. Contact, contact, taking fire from north, taking fire, man down, lead vehicle man down. Emily was already out of the Humvee. She moved low and fast to the eastern side of her vehicle, using it as cover, and she looked at the canyon walls with different eyes than anyone else in that convoy. She saw 3 firing positions, not one, not the one everyone was responding to. 3. And she saw something else. She saw Corporal Travis Bennett and Private First Class Jake Morrison 20 meters ahead of her position, crouching behind the front bumper of the second cargo vehicle and looking toward a shallow depression on the north side of the road. She could see them communicating with each other. She could see the decision forming. She could see it in Bennett's body language, in the way he was tense to move and the way Morrison was nodding. They were going to run for that depression. Emily's father had shown her this exact scenario when she was 12 years old. He had called it the false safe house, a feature of the terrain that looked like the most natural cover in the world from ground level, that felt like obvious instinct to move toward, and that was completely and utterly exposed from an angle that only someone thinking from the shooter's perspective could identify. That depression was not cover. It was the secondary kill zone. It was where the second sniper was waiting. Emily grabbed her radio. Her hands were not shaking. She was surprised to notice this. She had expected her hands to shake. Captain Walker. Her voice came out low and steady. She had not planned that either. Captain Walker, this is Carter. Do you copy? The radio traffic was chaos. 3 other voices were transmitting simultaneously. Walker's channel was overwhelmed. Captain Walker. She increased her voice by exactly 1 register. This is Carter. Emergency. Do you copy? A half-second pause in the chaos. Walker's voice. Carter, go ahead. Make it quick. Bennett and Morrison are about to move to the northern depression. Captain, that depression is a secondary kill zone. It is completely exposed from the eastern-southern ridge overlap. If they move, they are dead. Stop them now. There was a silence that lasted approximately 1 full second. 1 second in a firefight is a very long time. Say again, Carter. You're saying the depression is... It's a trap. It's designed to pull us off the road. There is a second shooter holding that angle. Stop them right now, Captain. Right now. Another pause. Shorter this time. Then Walker's voice changed, not slower, harder, more certain. Bennett, Morrison, hold your position. Do not move to the depression. That is a direct order. Do not move. Bennett and Morrison froze. 2 seconds later, 3 rounds tore through the northern depression and kicked up 3 columns of gravel and dust from the exact spot where their bodies would have been. The canyon went briefly quieter in the way that things go quiet after something has almost happened that cannot be taken back. Emily heard 25 soldiers breathe, and then she heard something she had not expected. She heard Captain Walker's voice, very quiet, just on her channel, just for her. "Carter, how did you know that?" It was not entirely a question. It was the kind of sentence that arrives when someone is processing information that does not fit the model of the world they had been operating in until 30 seconds ago. Emily pressed the transmit button. "I can explain later, Captain. Right now, I need to tell you something important about what we're dealing with. Talk to me. There are 3 shooters, not 1. 3. They are positioned at the northern eastern ridge, the southern ridge, upper shelf, and..." She calculated from memory from the map she had memorized from everything her father had ever taught her. "And there is a 3rd position that we have not yet taken fire from. That is the one I am most worried about." Another silence. She could feel Walker recalibrating on the other end. "You can identify their positions." "Yes." "From where you're standing?" "Yes, Captain." The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a decision being made. "Carter, come to my position. Right now." She moved through the firefight in a low crouch using the vehicles for cover, keeping her body below the sight lines she had calculated in her head. She had the rifle case in her left hand and the radio in her right, and she moved through the chaos with a calm that she herself did not entirely understand. Captain Walker was behind the second gun truck 40 meters from her position. He looked at her when she arrived. He looked at the rifle case in her hand. He looked back at her face. "That is not a standard issue communications kit," he said. "No, Captain, it is not." He looked at her for one more second. The shooting was continuing from the northern ridge. One of his soldiers was calling out a position report from the south side of the road. The air support ETA was still 53 minutes away. "What is it?" he asked. "It was my father's," she said. "He built it himself. He was a long-range marksman. He trained me for 10 years. Walker stared at her. "You're a sniper." "I was never officially trained, but yes." The words sat between them in the middle of a firefight at 6 in the morning, in a canyon in Montana with 2 confirmed shooters and 1 more they hadn't heard from yet. Walker was a good officer. He was the kind of good officer who could take information that violated every assumption he had made and process it in the time it took to take a breath. "Can you stop them?" he asked. Not "why didn't you tell me?" Not "what is this equipment doing on my convoy without authorization?" Not "how long have you been hiding this?" Just "can you stop them?" Emily looked at the rifle case in her hand. She thought about her mother. She thought about the promise. She thought about Private First Class Jake Morrison, 21 years old, who had been taking notes in a green notebook 12 hours ago and who was now pressed flat behind a cargo vehicle wheel because 2 seconds earlier he had almost run into a kill zone that would have ended his life before he ever had the chance to use any of those notes. She looked at Captain Walker. "Yes," she said. And for the first time in 6 years, Emily Carter stopped hiding who she was. She opened the case. The rifle came out into the morning light of a Montana canyon, assembled in her hands in 37 seconds by muscle memory that had never once gone away. And the 25 soldiers of the convoy, the ones who were close enough to see who were not actively returning fire from their positions, they went still. Not because they were afraid of her, because they recognized what they were looking at, not the rifle, the certainty, the way she handled it, the way she had already stopped looking at the rifle and had gone back to looking at the ridgeline with those calm, reading eyes. And Sergeant First Class Reeves, 12 years in the Army, 3 combat tours, 17 commendations, said one thing. He said, "Where has she been this whole deployment?" And Captain Walker, without looking away from Emily, said, "Waiting, apparently." Emily went flat against the Humvee frame and she breathed out slowly, and she looked up at the northern ridge, and she did what her father had taught her to do before anything else. She stopped being afraid. She stopped being the woman who had made a promise and kept it for 6 years and carried a grief that had no name attached to it. The grief of a gift unused, the grief of a capability kept in a locked case and taken out only alone, only in private, only in the dark of early mornings, when she could pretend she was just keeping the equipment maintained and not admitting to herself what she actually was. She stopped being all of that, and she became for the first time since her father's funeral entirely herself. She looked up at the ridgeline. She found the first position. She had 42 minutes of air support window to work with and 3 targets to eliminate and 25 people depending on a quiet communications specialist who had spent 6 years making sure nobody would ever need her to do exactly this. She exhaled. She calculated. She waited. And the mountains waited with her. The first thing Emily did was nothing. That was the part nobody understood at first. The shooting was still coming from the northern ridge. Rounds were hitting the road surface 20 meters to the left of the convoy's center position and kicking up gravel that rattled against the Humvee doors like thrown coins. Captain Walker had his soldiers in defensive positions behind every vehicle in the column, and his radio was going constantly, and the air support ETA had just been updated to 49 minutes, which was worse than the 53 minutes it had been 4 minutes ago, because somehow the math of a firefight always made time move backward. And Emily Carter was lying completely still between 2 Humvees with a rifle her father built by hand, and she was doing nothing. Sergeant First Class Reeves crawled up beside her after approximately 45 seconds of watching her be motionless. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a face that had been weathered by 12 years of exactly this kind of mourning, and he looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite succeeding. "Carter," he said, low voice, controlled. What are you doing?" "Waiting," she said, and she did not look away from the ridgeline. "Waiting for what?" "For the second shooter to make a mistake." Reeves was quiet for a moment. Another burst of fire came from the northern ridge higher this time, seeking rather than targeting, which told Emily something. She filed it. "How do you know there's a second shooter?" Reeves said. "Same way I knew about the depression," Emily said. "Because I looked at the map before we left, and I thought about it from their perspective instead of ours." Reeves processed this. "And you didn't say anything in the briefing because I'm the radio girl," Emily said. Flat, no bitterness in it, just the truth stated the way you state something that has been true for so long, it has stopped hurting. Almost. Reeves didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer. Walker's voice came over the radio. "Carter, give me a status. Talk to me." She pressed transmit without moving her eye position. "I have eyes on the first position, Captain. Northern Ridge Eastern Anchor. Approximately 860 meters. He's been adjusting his angle for the last 90 seconds, which tells me he does not have a clean shot at our current formation. He's frustrated. Frustrated shooters make small movements, and small movements are what I'm waiting for." A pause, then, "And the second Southern Ridge, he hasn't fired yet because he doesn't need to. He's coverage. He's the one who would have taken Bennett and Morrison if they'd moved to the Depression. He's waiting for someone in our position to do something predictable." "And the third," Emily breathed out very slowly. "I'm working on that, Captain." Another pause. She could feel Walker on the other end of that radio, holding everything together with the sheer force of an officer who understood that his job right now was to trust the one person in this canyon who could see what nobody else could see. "Copy that," Walker said. "You have everything you need." It was not a question. It was permission. Emily understood the difference. Corporal Danny Vasquez, 26 years old combat engineer, had ended up on his stomach 4 feet from Emily's position because the firefight had pushed his vehicle team into the same corridor between Humvees. He had been watching her for 3 minutes without saying anything, and finally he couldn't stop himself. "How far is 860 meters?" he asked. "More than half a mile," Emily said. Vasquez stared at her profile. Her eye was against the scope. Her body was as still as the granite walls above them. "You can hit something at half a mile. When conditions are right." "What are the conditions right now?" "Wind is 4 knots from the northwest. Humidity is manageable. Temperature is dropping because of the canyon shadow, which affects bullet drop at this range by approximately 3 centimeters. The shooter is at 43 degrees elevation, which changes my ballistic calculations significantly." She paused. "The conditions are workable." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Workable, he repeated. "Yes, see, that's all you've got, workable." I don't need perfect conditions, Emily said. I need a target to move. And then, as if the mountain had heard her, the first sniper moved. It was nothing dramatic. No sudden shift, no obvious error. It was a 4-inch lateral adjustment of position behind a granite outcropping on the northern ridgeline that produced a microsecond of exposed silhouette against the pale morning sky. 4 inches, less than the width of a standard dinner plate, visible for approximately a third of a second. Emily fired. The sound of the rifle in that canyon was enormous. Every soldier in the convoy flinched. Vasquez's face went completely blank. Even Reeves' 12 years of combat pulled his head down instinctively. Then silence. No more fire from the northern ridge. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Walker's voice, very quiet. Carter. First target is down, Emily said. She was already moving the rifle. Not to the second position. Not to the southern ridge where the coverage shooter was waiting. She moved it to the place on the ridgeline where the third shooter was supposed to be. The one nobody had fired from. The one that had been bothering her since she looked at the map 12 hours ago. Because that was the one that scared her. Anyone could predict the obvious positions. Any trained military mind looking at that terrain would find the northern ridge anchor and the southern coverage angle. Those were the geometry of the trap. Those were the positions you put in the plan. But Emily's father had taught her something that no map could show. The third position, he had told her once on a hillside in Montana when she was 15, and they were debating angles, is never where you expect it. The third position is where the best shooter goes. Not the most obvious cover, the best geometry, and the best shooter is always the one who's still alive when everyone else has already fired. She had been looking for the third position since before they entered the canyon. She had not found it yet, which meant the best shooter in that enemy team was still out there, still waiting, still choosing his moment, and she did not know where he was. That was the thing she had not told Captain Walker. That was the thing sitting cold in the center of her chest while she kept her breathing steady and her eye against the scope and her hands absolutely still on her father's rifle. Walker came to her position personally. He crawled the distance from the gun truck to the corridor between Humvees on his elbows and knees, which was something Emily had never seen a captain do before, and he arrived beside her breathing slightly harder than usual, and he looked at her and he asked one question. Where's the third one? I don't know yet, Emily said. Walker was very still for a moment. You said there were 3. There are 3. I know where 2 of them are. I know where the third one is not. She paused. That's different from knowing where he is. Explain that to me. The first shooter was the anchor, northern ridge eastern position covering the entrance and the first 2 vehicle lengths. Standard for this geometry. The second shooter is southern coverage holding the angles that the first one can't reach. Also standard. She kept her eye against the scope as she talked. The third one is the one who built this trap. He's not in a standard position. He's in the position I haven't considered yet. He hasn't fired because he doesn't need to fire. He's waiting for us to do something specific. What specific thing? I don't know that either. Walker sat with that for a moment. Another burst of fire from the southern ridge, the second shooter shifting positions, slightly probing. Emily tracked the angle, change filed. It did not respond. How many rounds do you have? Walker asked. 18. And you need 2 more shots. Minimum, possibly 3 for the second shooter, depending on his cover depth, and I don't have a shot on the third until he reveals himself. How do we make him reveal himself? Emily thought about her father. She thought about the way he used to set up training scenarios on the Montana hillside scenarios, where she had to find a hidden target without the target cooperating. She thought about the lesson he always came back to. You can't make the best sniper reveal himself by threatening him, she said. You reveal him by taking away what he's protecting. Walker looked at her. What's he protecting? His team. Emily finally pulled her eye from the scope and looked at Walker directly. Captain, the third shooter, has been watching me take down his anchor. He knows I got the first one. He knows I'm going to get the second one. The only move he has left is to either retreat or eliminate me before I can take his coverage shooter out. The word hung in the air between them. Walker did not look away from her face. He's going to try to take you out. Yes. So your plan is to make yourself the target? My plan, Emily said, is to let him think he has a shot at me and find his position when he moves to take it. Walker stared at her for a long moment. The sound of the southern shooter adjusting position echoed off the canyon walls. That is, Walker said slowly, The most dangerous plan I have heard in 14 years of service. I know, Emily said, and you're going to do it anyway. She looked back at the scope. I need the second shooter down first. Then I need 15 seconds of suppressive fire from every rifle in this convoy toward the southern ridge. Full volume, maximum noise. I need the third shooter to believe I'm exposed while everyone else is looking south. Walker looked at her for another 3 seconds. Command decisions at the speed of a firefight. Emily knew what he was calculating. She knew what it cost him to make that calculation. Tell me when you're ready, he said. She went back to work. The second shooter was better than the first. That was immediately apparent. He had not made the same lateral adjustment error. He had not given her a silhouette. He was tight behind his cover, and he was patient, and he understood angles in a way that told Emily he had training beyond basic infantry. Every time she thought she had found a shooting solution, he shifted slightly, not randomly, but methodically, like someone who understood exactly what she was looking for and was determined not to give it to her. Private First Class Morrison had crawled to a position 20 feet from Emily's without being told to carry extra ammunition for the vehicle's machine gun. He was not part of her plan. He had simply ended up there because the firefight had compressed the convoy into a small enough space that everyone was close together now. He watched her work with the expression of someone watching something they cannot entirely believe. You've been doing this your whole life, he said. It was barely above a whisper. Since I was 7, Emily said. 7 years old. My father started early. Morrison was quiet for a moment. My dad taught me to fish, he said. Emily almost smiled. She could feel it at the corner of her mouth, this completely inappropriate almost smile in the middle of a firefight, and she understood that this was how the human mind protects itself in impossible situations. It reaches for normal things. It reaches for fathers teaching their children something on a quiet afternoon. Where are you from? She asked. She kept her eye on the scope. Iowa, Morrison said. Ames, Iowa. Nice place. Flat, he said. Really flat. Nothing like this. He looked up at the canyon walls. I've never been anywhere like this. Focus on the road, Emily said gently. Don't look at the walls. Why primate? Because looking up makes you feel small. And right now I need you to feel exactly regular sized. Morrison looked back at the road. Yes, ma'am. She found the second shooter's pattern at the 17-minute mark. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing that required watching the same piece of ridgeline for 17 uninterrupted minutes with absolute concentration, filtering out every sound and movement in radio call and everything else the firefight threw at her attention. 17 minutes of patience that her father had spent a decade building into her muscle memory. The second shooter had a tell. Every time he shifted position, he shifted to his right, never to his left. It was a small bias, the kind of thing that develops from a dominant shoulder, from a slight physical preference that becomes habit under pressure. He was shifting right by approximately 6 inches every 45 to 60 seconds. And if Emily projected that pattern forward another cycle and accounted for the rocky shelf that constrained his movement on the left side, she could predict within a margin of 8 inches where his head would be in the next 30 to 40 seconds. 8 inches at this range. 8 inches was all she needed. She got on the radio. Captain Walker, I'm ready. Walker's voice came back immediately. On your call. I need 15 seconds of maximum suppressive fire on the southern ridge on my mark. Full volume. I need every rifle and every gunner firing simultaneously. I need it loud. Understood. Standing by. Emily settled deeper into her position. She felt the granite under her elbows. She felt the weight of the rifle exactly the way she had felt it 10,000 times on hillsides in Montana. She felt her father's hands, not literally, not in any way she could explain to anyone, but she felt the presence of everything he had taught her. The accumulated weight of a decade of Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings and summer evenings when the light went gold and he showed her again. The mathematics of patience, she breathed out. Mark, she said. Every weapon in the convoy opened up simultaneously. The noise was enormous. A wall of sound that slammed off the canyon walls and came back doubled, tripled the echoes layering on top of each other until the entire pass was one sustained roar of suppressive fire. The southern ridge lit up with impact dust, and in that noise Emily found the second shooter. He shifted right exactly as she had predicted. The bias held under pressure it always did. Under pressure, The body did what it had always done, training or no training. He moved to his right by 7 inches, and the edge of his position came out from behind its cover by approximately the margin of a human shoulder. Emily fired. The second shot. The second silence. Different from the first silence had been shock. This silence was something else. It was the silence of 24 soldiers realizing that the quiet woman with her father's rifle had just done it again, had just reached out across a distance that most of them had never shot at in their entire military careers, and removed a threat from the equation as efficiently as erasing chalk from a board. Vasquez said something under his breath that Emily didn't catch. Reeves said nothing at all. Walker's voice on the radio, "Carter, status." "2 down," she said. "Third one hasn't moved." "Copy. What do you need?" "Time," she said. "And everyone to hold their position. Nobody moves. Nobody changes their posture. I need this convoy to look exactly the way it looks right now." "For how long?" "Until he makes a decision." She had known this part was coming, and she had not let herself think too hard about it, because thinking too hard about it would produce exactly the kind of tension in her hands and her breathing that would cost her everything. The third shooter had watched her take down 2 of his people in under 20 minutes. He was skilled enough to have built this ambush, smart enough to have chosen the position nobody had predicted, patient enough to have not fired a single round while his team was being dismantled. That patience was about to run out. Her father's voice clear in her memory, the way it had not been since the week after his funeral. "The smartest sniper is always the quietest one, and the quietest one is always the most dangerous. But even the quietest one has a limit. Find the limit. Don't rush it. The limit will find you." She waited. Reeves had stopped talking. Morrison had stopped talking. Even the radio had gone quiet, Walker holding his channel clear for her. The southern ridge was still. The northern ridge was still. The canyon held its breath. 40 seconds. 60. 90 seconds of absolute silence in a canyon where 3 minutes ago, every weapon on both sides had been firing. Then Walker, unable to help himself, "Carter?" "Not yet," she said. 2 minutes. The cold was settling into her elbows where they pressed against the road surface. She could feel the blood pooling from the sustained pressure. She ignored it. Her father had trained her through worse. He had made her hold positions in Montana winter until her fingers were white and still asked her to call the wind. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. A tiny movement on the western upper ridge. Not the southern position. Not the northern position. The western upper ridge, a location she had assessed on the map as secondary, less optimal, a position she had rated as possible but unlikely because of its angle disadvantage at the eastern entry point. The third shooter had not chosen optimal. The third shooter had chosen unexpected. Emily felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite awe, but something in between them. A professional recognition. This person was good. This person had made a choice that sacrificed some geometric advantage specifically to be unpredictable, specifically to be in the place the opposing sniper would discount. This person had thought about her the same way she had thought about them. The movement was almost nothing, a repositioning of weight, a slight shift of angle. In any other circumstance, in any other moment, it would have been invisible. Emily had been waiting for exactly this for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. She adjusted her position by 11 degrees, recalculated the elevation, recalculated the wind. The canyon wind was different at the western upper ridge. She had to account for the deflection off the granite face her father had shown her, this specific scenario on a different mountain. But the physics were identical. Her breathing slowed to almost nothing. The western upper ridge, the unexpected position, the quietest one. She found the shooter in her scope. And for one frozen fraction of a second, she understood something about this person, whoever they were. Whatever they believed, whatever had brought them to this canyon on this particular cold morning, she understood that they were very good at what they did. And then she fired. The third shot echoed differently than the first two. It came back off the western face of the canyon at a different angle, a different pitch, and the echo moved through the pass in a way that made it sound like the mountain itself had spoken. Then nothing. No more fire, no movement on any ridge. The canyon was completely, totally, finally silent. 24 soldiers held their positions behind their vehicles and listened to the silence, and slowly, one by one, understood what it meant. Walker came back on the radio. His voice was steady, But there was something underneath it that Emily recognized as a man who had been holding himself in command mode for 25 minutes and was now very carefully beginning to let that grip loosen by a fraction. "Carter," he said, "report." Emily lowered the rifle from her shoulder. She rested it across her forearms. She looked up at the three ridge lines, northern, southern, western, and she listened to the silence for 5 full seconds to make certain it was real and not a pause. It was real. "3 down," she said. "All positions clear." The radio went quiet for a moment. Then Sergeant First Class Reeves, 12 years in the Army, 3 combat tours, 17 commendations. A man who had seen most of what war could produce in terms of human capability, Reeves got on the channel and said exactly 4 words. "God Almighty," he said. "Carter." Morrison was sitting up now, no longer pressed flat against the road surface. He was looking at Emily with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not admiration exactly, not gratitude exactly, something more specific than either of those things. The expression of a 21-year-old man from Ames, Iowa, who had come very close twice to not going home and who was looking at the person between him and that outcome. "Ma'am," he said. "Morrison," she said. "I need to write something in my notebook," he said. Emily looked at him. "Write what?" "I don't know yet," he said. "Something. I'll figure it out when I write it." She almost smiled again. This time, she let it happen. Captain Walker came to her position on foot, this time not crawling. The immediate threat was gone, and he walked through his own convoy like a man who understood that the geometry of danger had changed, and he came to where Emily was sitting on the road surface with her father's rifle across her lap, and he stood over her for a moment, and he looked at her the way people look at things that have just permanently altered their understanding of the world. "Carter," he said, "Captain, you need to explain something to me." "I know." "Not right now," he said. "Right now, I need to get this convoy out of this canyon and get a medical update on Sergeant Alvarez in the lead vehicle and call in the air support as a recovery asset. But when we're out of this canyon, you and I are going to have a very long conversation." "Yes, Captain." He looked at the rifle, then back at her face. "Your father built that." "Yes." "He taught you." "For 10 years. Walker nodded slowly. He was processing it. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Emily looked down at the rifle in her hands. The weight of it was familiar and complicated and entirely her own. "Because I promised my mother I would never use it," she said, "and because I was afraid that if I told anyone, they would either not believe me or expect things from me that I wasn't ready to give." Walker was quiet for a moment. And now, Emily looked up at the ridgelines. 3 positions, all silent. The canyon beginning to fill with the sound of soldiers moving, checking, calling status, doing the work that comes after the worst is over. "Now," she said, "I think the promise was already broken the moment I didn't speak up in the briefing room." Walker looked at her steadily. "You did speak up," he said, "and you spoke up when it mattered." She thought about Bennett and Morrison and the Northern Depression. She thought about 2 seconds and what 2 seconds contained. "I almost didn't," she said. "But you did," Walker said. "That's what happened. That's the fact." He turned to go back to the front of the convoy. Then he stopped and turned back. "Carter." "Captain." "Next briefing it," he said. "You sit in the front." He walked away before she could answer. Emily looked at the rifle in her lap. She thought about her father. She thought about 10 years of Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, and the way he used to say her name when she got something exactly right, not loud, not dramatic, just her name said in a particular tone that meant everything. She thought about her mother's voice. She thought about the promise. She thought about Ames, Iowa. She began to field strip the rifle for her cleaning because that was what you did after you fired it, because her father had taught her that the weapon deserved care in proportion to the work it had done. And around her slowly the convoy began to move. Nobody asked her to pack up quickly. Nobody told her she was in the way. Nobody treated her like the radio girl. They made room for her one by one the way people make room for someone they have only just seen clearly for the first time. And Emily Carter, 28 years old, communications specialist, daughter of Robert Carter of Billings, Montana, sat in the cold morning light of Black Eagle Pass and cleaned her father's rifle with hands that were not shaking and did not let herself think yet about what came next. Because what came next was going to change everything. She just didn't know yet how much of it was coming from outside the canyon, and how much of it had been waiting inside their own walls all along. The convoy cleared Black Eagle Pass at 0741 hours. 34 minutes after the first shot, 25 soldiers rolled out of that canyon in 12 vehicles with one man wounded. Sergeant Alvarez lead vehicle A through and through to the left shoulder that the medic had already stabilized and declared non-life-threatening, and 3 enemy snipers neutralized on 3 separate ridge lines by a communications specialist nobody had looked at twice in 6 years. Emily sat in the back of her Humvee and said nothing the entire drive out of the pass. Reeves was in the front seat again, and he did not attempt conversation, which she appreciated. Morrison was driving with both hands tight on the wheel, and the focused expression of someone who had decided that doing his exact job precisely correctly was the most important thing he could do with his body and his attention. And Emily appreciated that too. The radio channels were full of Walker coordinating the recovery operation, calling in the air support as medical extraction rather than fire support, accounting for every person and every vehicle and every piece of equipment with the systematic thoroughness of a man who ran good after actions, the same way he ran good briefings. Emily held the rifle case in her lap. She had not put it back under the bench seat. She was not sure she was going to put it back under anything ever again. She was not sure exactly what she was going to do with it. She was not sure what she was going to do with herself in the larger sense that the last 34 minutes had made suddenly and unavoidably relevant. She had broken the promise. She had broken it at 0607 hours and 2 seconds with the first shot, and there was no way to put that back together. The only question was, what came after it? She was still sitting with that question when the convoy reached the staging area at the base of the pass, and Walker was out of his vehicle before it fully stopped and walking directly toward her Humvee with the purposeful stride of a man who had been waiting to have a specific conversation for 34 minutes. "Carter," he said when she stepped out. "With me." They walked 30 meters from the nearest vehicle, far enough for privacy, close enough that Walker could still see his soldiers. He turned to face her, and he looked at her with the direct, no-margin attention of a man who needed complete information and was going to get it. "Start from the beginning," he said. She told him everything. Her father, the training, the years of it, the scope of it, what it had produced in her and what it had cost her, and the promise to her mother, and the rifle case, and the map, and Black Eagle Pass, and what she had seen in 11 minutes that she had not said in the briefing room. Walker listened without interrupting. That was something she had not expected. She had expected him to stop her at some point to ask a question or make a judgment or respond to some specific piece of information. He did not. He listened to all of it with his arms crossed and his eyes on her face, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You saw the trap on the map," he said finally, "before we left." "Yes, Captain." "And you didn't speak?" "No, Captain, because you thought no one would listen." Emily looked at him steadily. "Because I knew no one would listen, Captain." There is a difference. Walker absorbed that. She could see him absorbing it, could see the discomfort of it moving across his face and being filed somewhere honest inside him. "You might have been right," he said. He said it quietly, and he said it like it cost him something. "I know I was right," she said, and knowing that didn't make it easier to stay quiet. It made it worse. Another silence. Then Walker uncrossed his arms and looked out toward the mountains. "Alvarez is going to be fine," he said. "That round went clean through. 6 to 8 weeks, and he's back." "I know," Emily said. "I saw the wound before the medic did. The angle told me it missed the bone." Walker looked at her sideways. "Of course it did," he said. He almost sounded tired. "Is there anything you looked at out there that you didn't immediately calculate something about?" "Not much," she said honestly. He almost smiled. "Not quite, but close." "I need to file a report," he said, "and the report is going to raise questions. Questions about who you are and what equipment you were carrying and why nobody knew about any of this before today." "I understand." "Are you ready for those questions?" Emily thought about that for a moment. The real version of that question, not the procedural one. Was she ready to stop being invisible? Was she ready to be seen for what she actually was in all the complicated weight of what that meant? "I don't know," she said, "but I don't think that's the most important question right now." Walker looked at her. How did they know we were coming?" Emily said. "How did 3 shooters end up in exactly the right positions before we entered that pass? We confirmed the route less than 14 hours before departure. The briefing was classified. The convoy composition was need to know. She paused. Captain, that ambush was not improvised. It was built around specific intelligence about our exact route and our exact timing. Someone told them we were coming. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than any of the silences in the canyon. Walker looked at her and his face had changed. You think we have a leak, he said. I think we have worse than a leak, Emily said. I think someone inside our own structure deliberately routed us through that pass. Walker stared at her for 3 full seconds. That's an extraordinary accusation, specialist. I know, she said. It's also the only explanation that fits the geometry of what we drove into. She watched him think. She watched the soldier in him process the tactical information, and the officer in him process the implications, and the human being in him process the thing underneath all of it, which was that, if she was right, then someone who wore the same uniform had sent 25 of them into a carefully engineered death. I need to make some calls, Walker said. His voice had gone flat and careful in a way that told her he had moved into a different mode entirely. Yes, Captain. And Carter, he turned back to face her fully. The conversation we just had, the part about the leak that stays between us until I know who I can trust. She understood that immediately and completely. Yes, Captain. He walked away toward the communications truck. Emily stood in the cold morning air and felt the weight of what she had just said settle over her like a second gravity. She was not done yet. She had known it somewhere underneath the 34 minutes of the firefight and the drive out of the pass and the conversation with Walker. She had known it with the same quiet certainty. She knew everything, not as a guess, but as a calculation with too many confirmed variables to dismiss. 3 snipers in perfect position. A route confirmed less than 14 hours before departure. A classified briefing. A convoy that should not have been predictable. Someone had made it predictable. She went back to her vehicle, and she sat on the bench seat with the rifle case beside her, and she pulled out her communications equipment, the actual equipment, the radio gear that was her official reason for existing in this convoy, and she started working. Not because anyone told her to, because her hands needed something to do while her mind worked, and because there was something she had noticed during the firefight that she had not had the space to examine yet. The encrypted radio. When she had been moving through the convoy during the firefight, repositioning between vehicles, she had passed close to Staff Sergeant Victor Hayes' position. Hayes was the fire support coordinator responsible for calling in artillery and air assets. He had been behind the rearmost gun truck, which was tactically reasonable. What was not tactically reasonable was what she had glimpsed on the portable comms unit in his hand. She had not had time to process it during the firefight. She had processed it in the back of the Humvee during the drive out of the pass quietly while Reeves drove and Morrison kept both hands on the wheel. The encryption sequence on Hayes' unit had been wrong. Not broken, not malfunctioning. Wrong. Set to a frequency configuration that was outside standard operational parameters. She had seen it for less than 2 seconds. She had not been certain enough to say anything. She was still not entirely certain. But she was close enough to certain that it was eating at her. Staff Sergeant Victor Hayes, 34 years old, 7 years of service, fire support coordinator, which meant he had access to operational logistics at a level that very few enlisted personnel reached. He knew routes, he knew timing, he knew convoy composition. He had recommended Black Eagle Pass as the optimal route 3 days ago. Emily had not been in that planning meeting. She had no official reason to know this. But she had been in the communications center when the recommendation came through on the planning channel, and she had noted it the way she noted everything automatically, without intending to, the way her father had trained her to absorb the landscape of any environment she moved through. Hayes had recommended the pass, and Hayes had an encrypted radio set to a configuration she had never seen before. She needed to see it again. She was still sitting with that thought when the air support arrived 2 helicopters 47 minutes after the first shot coming in loud and fast over the ridgeline. And the staging area became organized chaos again, and Emily made a decision she had not entirely planned. She got up, left her vehicle, and walked toward Hayes' position at the rear of the convoy. Hayes was a big man, broad through the shoulders with a neat dark beard, and the kind of easy physical confidence that comes from years of being good at a physically demanding job. He was standing beside the rear gun truck, watching the helicopters approach, and he turned when Emily came up beside him. "Carter," he said. He sounded normal. He sounded like a man watching helicopters arrive. "Hell of a morning." Yes, Emily said, it was. She positioned herself so that she was standing at a natural conversational angle to him, while having a direct sight line to the communications unit on his hip. She kept her voice casual. Your radio working all right through the firefight, she said. I was having some frequency interference on the mid-range channels. Wanted to check if anyone else had the same issue. Hayes glanced down at the unit on his hip, reflexively the way people look at something when someone mentions it, and Emily saw it. For 2 seconds. Clean and clear. The encryption configuration was wrong, not degraded, not corrupted by the firefight, intentionally set to an output frequency that sat between standard military channels in a band that would be very difficult to detect without knowing exactly what to look for. A broadcasting frequency. Hayes had been transmitting on a channel no one was monitoring. Seemed fine to me, Hayes said. He was already looking back at the helicopters. Emily kept her voice even. Good. Glad it wasn't a broader issue. She walked back toward her vehicle at a pace that she controlled very deliberately. Not fast, not slow. The pace of a woman who had just completed a routine equipment check and was returning to her station. She sat down on her bench seat. She put her hands on her knees. Her hands were shaking now. They had not shaken during the firefight. They had not shaken during any of the 3 shots. But they were shaking now in the aftermath of a 2-second look at an encrypted radio because she understood what it meant, and the understanding of it was larger and colder than anything she had felt in the canyon. Someone in this convoy had orchestrated 25 deaths. She had her radio in her hands before she fully made the decision to use it. Captain Walker, she said. Private channel, low voice. I need to speak with you. Now, away from the convoy. Walker came back in under 15 seconds. Copy. 2 minutes. The 2 minutes were the longest 2 minutes Emily had experienced since her father's last morning in the hospital. She sat in the Humvee and looked at the floor and breathed carefully and thought about what she was about to say and what it would set in motion and whether she was certain enough. She was certain enough. Walker appeared at the vehicle door. One look at her face and he stepped up into the Humvee and pulled the door closed behind him. Talk, he said. Hayes, she said. Staff Sergeant Victor Hayes. Walker went very still. What about Hayes? His communications unit is set to a broadcast frequency that sits outside standard operational bands. I saw it during the firefight when I was repositioning. I confirmed it just now. She paused. He recommended Black Eagle Pass as the optimal route 3 days ago. Walker looked at her without speaking for a moment. You're sure about the frequency? I'm a communications specialist captain. This is the one thing I am absolutely sure about. Another silence. The helicopters were loud outside the vehicle. The staging area was full of noise and movement. Inside the Humvee, it was very quiet. Hayes has been with this unit for 14 months, Walker said. It was not a defense. It was the sound of a man whose world had just shifted and who was making an honest accounting of what he now had to carry. I know, Emily said. He's trusted. Walker stopped. He's the one who filed the logistics request that changed our departure time to 0600 instead of 0700. Emily stared at him. 0600 instead of 0700. 1 hour earlier, which meant the convoy entered the pass at the precise moment when the canyon walls would block direct sunlight and create the shadow conditions that had affected her ballistic calculations. Shadow conditions that a sniper team would have anticipated and built their positioning around. Shadow conditions that would not have existed at 0700. The departure time change had not been random. It had been engineered to create optimal conditions for the ambush. He moved the timeline, Emily said. Her voice was very quiet. He moved the timeline to match the shadow window. Walker was looking at a point on the floor of the Humvee. He was doing the same thing Emily had done, taking a piece of information and watching it connect to everything else, watching the picture that emerged from the connections. If I move on him without authority, Walker said slowly, and I'm wrong, even if I'm right, this becomes a jurisdictional problem that could let him destroy evidence. I need counterintelligence. I need someone with the authority to act on this. Fort Liberty Operations Center, Emily said. Yes. He looked at her. I'm going to make a call on a secure channel. I need you to stay close and I need you to document everything you remember about the frequency configuration. Write it down, exact numbers if you have them. I have them, Emily said. I don't need to write them down. I won't forget. Walker looked at her for a moment. He had stopped being surprised by her, she realized. At some point in the last hour and 40 minutes, he had recalibrated completely and was now operating on a model of Emily Carter that bore no resemblance to the one he had worked with for the previous 4 months. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you will." He reached for his secure radio, and then something happened that neither of them had anticipated. Hayes's voice came over the main convoy channel. Calm, professional routine. "Captain Walker Air Support is requesting logistics confirmation for the extraction. They need the casualty count and equipment manifest. Do you want me to transmit?" Walker looked at Emily. Emily looked at Walker. Hayes was asking for permission to transmit on a communications unit that was broadcasting on a channel no one was monitoring. Whatever he sent on that unit under the cover of the routine logistics request would go somewhere it was not supposed to go, to someone who was not supposed to receive it, who was almost certainly waiting for an after-action update on whether the ambush had succeeded. If Hayes transmitted now, whatever remained of the network on the other end would know the ambush had failed. They would know the convoy survived. They would know potentially that someone had started asking questions. Walker keyed his radio. "Negative, Hayes, I'll handle the transmission personally. Stand by." A pause on the channel. Very brief. The kind of pause that means nothing if you are not listening for it and means everything if you are. "Copy that, sir," Hayes said. Emily and Walker looked at each other in the quiet of the Humvee, and what passed between them in that look was the shared understanding that the window was closing. Whatever Hayes intended to do with the information he had, he would do it before they reached Fort Liberty, before anyone with the authority to arrest him was within range, before the evidence on his communications unit could be secured. They had less time than they thought. "I need that counterintelligence call in the next 5 minutes," Emily said. "I know." Walker was already dialing. While he made the call, Emily sat with her hands still on her knees and thought about Staff Sergeant Victor Hayes. She thought about the 14 months he had been in this unit, trusted and competent and professionally impressive. She thought about the planning meetings she had been in the same building for where his voice had carried the easy authority of a man who knew his job. She thought about the way he had said hell of a morning when she walked up beside him, and the complete normalcy of it, the absolute practiced absence of anything that looked like guilt. 7 years of service. He had worn the uniform for 7 years. She thought about Private First Class Morrison, 21 years old from Ames, Iowa, who had been taking notes in a green notebook yesterday and who had almost died this morning in a kill zone that Hayes had engineered. She thought about that for a long time. Walker finished the call. His face told her the answer before he spoke. "Major Daniel Brooks," he said, "counterintelligence. He's at Fort Liberty and he's being briefed right now on everything I just told him. He wants us back at base immediately. Full convoy, no stops, and Hayes is not to be informed of the route change." "What about his communications unit?" "Brooks wants it intact. He wants Hayes to believe he's still operational. If he transmits, Brooks wants to know what frequency he's transmitting on and what he sends." Emily understood. They wanted Hayes to complete the transmission. They wanted to trace the signal. "We're going to let him send his update," she said. "Under controlled conditions," Walker said, "with Brooks's team monitoring the frequency you identified. And if he figures out we know, then we have a different problem," Walker said. He looked at her steadily. "But you've been solving problems today that nobody else could see, Carter. I'm going to trust that you'll see that one too if it comes." She almost said something about the weight of that trust, about what it felt like to have someone put the full confidence of a decision like this on her shoulders after 4 months of being invisible. She didn't say it. She stored it in the same place she stored everything. "When do we move?" she asked. 15 minutes. I need to get the helicopters off with Alvarez first." "And Hayes loads with the rest of the convoy. Same vehicle assignment, same position. Nothing changes." "Nothing changes." Emily repeated it to herself. Nothing in her behavior, her posture, her interaction with Hayes for the next 45 minutes of convoy travel between the staging area and Fort Liberty. She would have to be invisible again. Not the old kind of invisible, not the hiding kind, but a new and more demanding kind. She would have to be invisible on purpose, with intent, while knowing what she knew and watching a man who had sold 25 lives smile and perform his duties and wait for his moment to report his failure to the people who had sent him. Her father had never trained her for this particular skill. This one she was going to have to figure out on her own. Across the staging area, Hayes was standing beside the rear gun truck, watching the helicopter lift, with Alvarez aboard. He had his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, and he looked from where Emily sat in the Humvee like a man watching a routine extraction with the professional attention of someone who cared about the outcome. She watched him. She thought about the encrypted radio on his hip. She thought about the frequency it was set to. She thought about whoever was on the other end of that frequency, waiting in the silence of an ambush gone wrong, waiting for the update that would tell them whether to run or regroup or adjust their plan. She thought about her father saying, "Find the limit. The limit will find you." She had found 3 snipers this morning with the patience her father had built into her one training session at a time. She was going to need every piece of that patience now, because the man who had sent 3 snipers into those mountains was standing 30 meters away from her, wearing the same uniform, breathing the same mountain air, and he had no idea she had already found him. Walker came to the vehicle door. "Oh, we move in 10, he said. "You good?" Emily looked at Hayes across the staging area. She looked at the way he stood, the easy confidence of a man who believed he was still in control of the situation. "I'm good," she said, and she meant it. The convoy formed up around them in the cold morning light, engines turning over one by one, soldiers climbing into their assigned vehicles with the quiet efficiency of people who have survived something and are now focused entirely on the next task. Hayes climbed into the rear gun truck without looking toward Emily's position. He exchanged a few words with the gunner. He checked his radio. She saw him do it, a quick downward glance at the unit on his hip, and then he settled into his seat. Emily watched him do all of it, and then the convoy began to move, heading south toward Fort Liberty, and the mountains of Black Eagle Pass receded behind them, and Emily Carter sat in the back of the third Humvee with her father's rifle on the seat beside her, and a secret in her chest, and a plan that had not yet been given its name. She was not hiding anymore. She was hunting, and the man in the rear gun truck did not know it yet. The convoy hit the Fort Liberty main gate at 09:23 hours. 46 minutes of driving south from the staging area, and Emily had spent every single one of those minutes watching the rear gun truck in the side mirror of her Humvee. Not constantly, not obviously. The way her father had taught her to watch things, she didn't want to appear to be watching with peripheral attention, with the kind of unfocused focus that processes movement without locking onto it the way you watch a deer at the edge of a field if you want it to stay. Hayes had checked his radio unit 4 times during the drive. She had counted. The first check was at the staging area just before the convoy moved. The second was approximately 12 minutes into the drive when the road curved east and the mountains fell behind them and the terrain opened up into the broad valley approach to Fort Liberty. The third was at the 20-minute mark, a longer look, fingers moving over the unit in a way that could have been routine confirmation of settings and was almost certainly not. The fourth was 8 minutes from the gate brief, a downward glance that lasted less than 3 seconds. He had not transmitted. She was certain of that. The fourth check had the quality of a man deciding something, and the decision had been not yet, which meant he was waiting for a better moment, which meant he had not given up, which meant he still believed he was in control of this situation. Major Daniel Brooks was waiting inside the gate. Emily recognized counterintelligence officers the way she recognized sniper positions, not because she had extensive experience with them, but because she understood geometry, and the geometry of a man standing precisely where he could observe every vehicle entering the motor pool without appearing to observe anything was unmistakable. Brooks was 50, compact with gray at his temples and eyes that moved the way water moves, constantly covering everything, settling nowhere. He was in uniform, but the uniform sat on him differently than it sat on a combat officer. It sat the way a tool sits, useful, correct for the purpose, nothing extra. He looked at Emily's Humvee as it pulled into the motor pool. She looked back at him. He gave her nothing. She gave him nothing. That was the correct exchange. Walker was out of his vehicle in seconds and moving toward Brooks with the contained urgency of a man who had been holding a conversation in his head for 46 minutes and was finally able to have it out loud. They walked together toward the operations building without appearing rushed, which was the right choice because Hayes was 40 meters behind them and still in his vehicle and still presumably watching. Emily got out of her Humvee. She stretched because stretching was a normal human thing to do after 46 minutes in a vehicle. She pulled her communications equipment from the back seat. She walked toward the communications center because that was where she was supposed to go after a convoy operation, because that was her job, because nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. She said it to herself 3 more times. Sergeant First Class Reeves fell into step beside her without being asked. He did it naturally, the way a man does something he has decided to do without making a production of the decision. Brooks is here, Reeves said. Low voice, flat affect. I noticed, Emily said. Walker brief you on what happens next. Enough. They walked in silence for several steps. Around them, the convoy was doing its post-operation breakdown, vehicles being parked and logged, equipment being accounted for, soldiers moving through the practice motions of a unit coming in from a mission. Normal, routine, the sounds and rhythms of a base processing its people back through the gate. Hayes is getting out of his vehicle, Reeves said. Same low voice. Emily did not look. What's he doing? Talking to Corporal Vasquez. Looks routine. Now Reeves paused. He's looking at the operations building. Is Walker visible from where Hayes is standing? No, Walker and Brooks went inside. Good, Emily said. They reached the communications center, and Emily went inside and set her equipment on the bench and began the standard post-operation checklist, because the checklist was real and needed to be done, and because doing real work was the best possible cover for the conversations she needed to have with herself. Hayes had not transmitted during the convoy drive. He had checked his unit 4 times and decided not to transmit. That meant he was either suspicious or cautious or both, and the distinction mattered. A suspicious Hayes was unpredictable. A cautious Hayes was still operating on a plan, which meant he had a plan, which meant there was a specific moment he was waiting for. What moment? She ran it forward. Hayes knew the ambush had failed. He had been in the convoy. He had watched the firefight. He had seen Emily take down 3 shooters with a rifle nobody knew she had. He did not know what she had seen on his communications unit. He did not know that Walker had called Brooks. He did not know that he was the subject of a counterintelligence operation that had been running for the 46 minutes since they left the staging area. What he did know was that the people on the other end of his frequency were waiting for an update. He would transmit before the end of the duty day, before the routine security sweep that happened every evening at Fort Liberty, that would, if anyone was specifically looking for it, detect the anomalous frequency on his unit. He would transmit in a window that looked routine, that gave him cover, that allowed him to claim technical error or equipment malfunction if anyone found the signal. He had 3 to 4 hours. Emily finished the post-operation checklist in 11 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than standard, and then she sat at her bench and waited. The door to the communications center opened at 1006 hours. It was Brooks. He came in alone, closed the door, and stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides, and he looked at Emily with those constantly moving eyes that had gone still for the first time. Specialist Carter, he said. Major Brooks, she said. Captain Walker tells me a great many things about this morning, Brooks said. I want to hear them from you. She told him. She told him about the map in the briefing room and Black Eagle Pass and the 3 shots and Hayes's communications unit and the frequency configuration and the 4 checks during the drive and the 46 minutes of watching the mirror and everything she had calculated about his transmission window. Brooks listened without interrupting, the way Walker had listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You identified the frequency configuration in 2 seconds during an active firefight while repositioning between vehicles. Yes. And confirmed it during a casual 2-minute interaction at the staging area. Yes. Without him knowing you had identified it either time. Yes. Brooks looked at her for a long moment. You are not what your file says you are. My file is accurate, Emily said. My file says I'm a communications specialist. I am a communications specialist. It doesn't say anything about everything else because I never told anyone about everything else. Why not? She told him about her father, about the training, about the promise. He listened to this too with the same quality of attention, and she noticed that his face did not shift into the evaluative mode she had expected, did not begin the calculation of how to use this information professionally. He just listened to it as a human story, which was something she had not expected from a counterintelligence officer. When she finished, he said, Your father sounds like an extraordinary man. He was, Emily said, a brief silence. Then Brooks became the counterintelligence officer again smoothly without announcement. Here is what we know, he said. Digital forensics ran a preliminary check on Hayes's communication records during the last 48 hours while you were in transit. We found encrypted outbound transmissions on 3 occasions, all within the standard duty window, all structured to appear as routine logistics confirmations. He paused. The encryptions are consistent with a foreign intelligence cutout. We are talking about deliberate, systematic espionage, not a one-time lapse, not coercion, deliberate. Emily absorbed that. He chose this. Everything we have indicates yes, Brooks said. He changed the departure time. He recommended the route. He structured the convoy composition to maximize the vulnerability of the communications vehicle. He looked at her. Your vehicle was positioned third from the front specifically because Hayes filed a tactical recommendation placing communications assets forward. That recommendation went through Walker unquestioned because Hayes is trusted and the recommendation was tactically sound on its surface. Emily sat with that for a moment. Hayes had specifically positioned her vehicle to be third from the front. Third from the front in the optimal kill zone for the first sniper's eastern anchor position. If she had been a standard communications specialist, if she had been what everyone believed she would have been among the first casualties. Hayes had tried to kill her first. He had just not known exactly what he was trying to kill. He didn't know about the rifle, she said. No one did, Brooks said. If he had known, Emily said slowly, he would have positioned me differently. Farther back, less exposed. He would have been more careful. Correct. His ignorance of your actual capabilities was a critical tactical error, Brooks said, and then very quietly, which is somewhat ironic given how much trouble that ignorance has caused you. She looked at him. He held her gaze steadily. I have read between the lines of what you've told me, Specialist. You have spent 6 years being invisible because you were afraid of what visibility would cost you. And the one thing that threatened this entire operation and 25 lives was that invisibility. It landed hard. She did not look away from it. I know, she said. I'm not criticizing you, Brooks said. I'm telling you because it's relevant to what happens after today. He paused, and a great deal is going to happen after today. Before she could ask what that meant, his radio crackled. The voice on the other end was one of his team, flat and professional. Major Brooks, subject is moving. He's heading toward the equipment bay. Has his personal kit. Brooks looked at Emily. He's going to transmit. Equipment bay has a secondary communications node, Emily said immediately. Hardline access to the external relay. If he plugs into the hardline instead of broadcasting wirelessly, the signal footprint is smaller and harder to triangulate in real time. Brooks was already on his radio. Do not intercept. Let him reach the equipment bay. Full monitoring on the hardline node. I want the transmission recorded end to end before anyone moves. He looked at Emily. Can you be in the equipment bay without appearing out of place? I do routine maintenance checks on the hardline nodes every Tuesday, Emily said. Today is Tuesday. Brooks stared at her for a half second. Of course it is, he said. He almost sounded like Walker had sounded in the canyon. Almost tired, almost something else underneath it. I'll need 5 minutes head stead, Emily said. Go. She was out of the communications center and moving across the motor pool at a pace that was slightly faster than her standard walk and not fast enough to be notable. And she reached the equipment bay at 1,019 hours, 4 minutes and 30 seconds before Hayes arrived. The equipment bay was a large workspace full of the organized complexity of military communications and electronics infrastructure, and Emily had spent many hours in it doing exactly what she was about to appear to be doing. She pulled a maintenance panel and started on the hardline node diagnostic with the practiced routine of someone who had performed this check 40 times, and she was 8 minutes into it when the bay door opened and Hayes came in. He stopped when he saw her. She did not look up. Carter, he said. Hey, Hayes, she said, casual, looking at the panel. Didn't know you had kit in here today. Returning some survey equipment, he said. His voice was normal. Professionally normal? She was listening to every layer of it. Walker have you doing damage assessment from the ambush, she asked, still not looking up. Something like that. He moved through the bay toward the secondary equipment racks on the far side, away from her position but within the same room. Hell of a morning, he said again, the same phrase he'd used at the staging area. Yeah, Emily said. She heard him moving equipment. She heard the sounds of a man doing something with deliberate casualness, making noise that covered other noise. She had been in enough situations today where noise covered something else that she had become very good at hearing through it. A faint, specific click. The hardline node on his side of the bay had just been accessed. Emily continued her diagnostic. Her hands were steady. She thought about the fact that every second Hayes spent connected to that hardline was a second Brooks's team was recording, tracing, building the evidentiary chain that a court-martial would require. She thought about the instruction, let him transmit, let him complete it. Full recording end to end. She needed him in that bay for at least 4 minutes. You were something else out there, Hayes said. His voice came from across the bay, conversational, completely natural. Where did that come from? Nobody knew you could shoot like that. My dad, Emily said. Same casual register. He was a long-range marksman, civilian, trained me when I was a kid. And you just never mentioned it. Never seemed relevant, she said. A pause. She heard him doing something. The sounds were deliberate and sequential in a way that told her he was composing a message, not pulling survey equipment. Seems pretty relevant today, Hayes said. Yeah, she said. Today it was. She gave him another 30 seconds, and then she said, still looking at her panel, Hayes, you know what I never understood about the route recommendation for this morning? Black Eagle Pass is 20 minutes longer than the Valley route. What was the tactical advantage? A pause, shorter than it should have been if the question was unexpected. Slightly longer than it should have been if it was entirely routine. Avoids the Valley Road construction, he said. Engineering had it flagged as a potential IED route for the next 2 weeks. Right, Emily said. I saw that flag. Seemed like the right call. She paused. Except the engineering flag was filed 5 days ago, and Walker confirmed the Valley route was cleared 3 days ago. The flag was superseded. Silence. Complete silence from Hayes' side of the bay. Emily kept her eyes on the maintenance panel. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She breathed through it. I must have missed the updated clearance, Hayes said. His voice was still controlled. Slightly too controlled, the way things get when someone is applying control deliberately. Probably, Emily said. Easy to miss. She heard him disconnect from the hard line. 4 minutes and 12 seconds of connection time. She had given him 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and whatever he had transmitted in that window was now in Brooks's possession from beginning to end. She heard him moving toward the bay door. Carter, he said. She looked up. For the first time since he had entered the bay, she looked directly at him. He was standing at the door and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the easy confidence of the staging area. Not the professional calm of the convoy. Something that was reading the room. Something that was adding things up and not entirely liking the sum. Good shooting this morning, well, he said. Thank you, she said. He left. Emily looked at the door for 3 seconds after it closed. Then she picked up her radio. Brooks, she said. We have it, Brooks said immediately. Full transmission. 14 lines of encrypted text. Decryption is already running. A pause. He's walking toward the barracks. My team has eyes on him. We'll move when the decryption confirms. It will confirm, Emily said. I know, Brooks said. Carter. Sir. You just did something very difficult in a way that most trained counterintelligence officers would have struggled with. A pause. I want you to know that I noticed. She did not answer that. She did not have words for it that she trusted. At 10:48 hours, the decryption came back. Brooks called Walker and Emily to the operations center, a secure room with no windows and a long table and the kind of overhead lighting that makes everything look flat and serious. The decrypted transmission was on the screen, and it was worse than Emily had fully let herself imagine. Hayes had not just provided route information. The transmission contained convoy composition vehicle assignments, personnel roster, communications frequencies, and a damage assessment of the ambush, noting that the operation had failed due to, quote, an unexpected asset whose capabilities were not included in the pre-mission intelligence package. Hayes had already identified Emily as the reason the ambush failed, and he had identified her to someone. He knows about you, Walker said. He was looking at the screen and his voice was very quiet. He knew the moment I fired the first shot, Emily said. He just didn't know who I was before that. He does now, Brooks said, and whoever he transmitted to also knows, which means which means whoever he was working for knows that the convoy survived because of a female communications specialist with long-range rifle capability who was previously unidentified in their intelligence picture, Emily said. The room was very quiet. Brooks looked at Walker. Walker looked at Emily. There was a conversation happening in that exchange of looks that did not require words. They'll want to identify you, Walker said. Officially, you don't exist as an asset. You're a no-threat database. You have no operational profile. You're a communications specialist. I was a communications specialist, Emily said. Another silence. Brooks made a decision. Emily could see him make visibly the way command decisions move across a person's face. I'm calling for the arrest now, he said, before Hayes can make any additional contact or attempt to leave the installation. He reached for his radio. Walker, I need you to keep this room clear. Carter, stay in this building. He stepped out. Emily sat at the long table and looked at the decrypted transmission on the screen. She read it 3 times. She read the clinical encoded language of it, the deliberate absence of emotion in the way Hayes had reported 25 lives in their survival or death as data points in a larger calculation. She thought about what he had written, an unexpected asset whose capabilities were not included in the pre-mission intelligence package. That was her. 6 years of invisibility, and in the end it had been the one thing that saved everyone. Not her shooting, not her calculation, the invisibility itself. The fact that nobody had known who she was, including the people who had tried to kill her. Her father had never taught her that lesson. She had arrived at it on her own. Walker sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen. How are you doing? He asked. Not the officer question, the human one. She considered the honest answer. I don't know yet, she said. I think I'm going to need a few days before I know. That's fair, he said. Captain. She looked at him. When Hayes filed the vehicle placement recommendation putting me 3rd from the front, was that reviewed by anyone else before it was approved? Walker looked at her steadily. No, he said. It came through me and I approved it without a second review. Because Hayes is because I trusted his judgment on tactical placement. He put me in the first kill zone, Emily said. Deliberately. I know. He didn't know what I was. He just knew where to put a comm specialist to maximize the damage. I know that too, Walker said. His voice had something in it she recognized as a man holding himself accountable for something that was not entirely his fault and doing it honestly anyway. The sound came from outside the building before either of them could say anything else. Not a shot, not an explosion. A voice. Hayes' voice raised above its normal register, the practice calm, completely gone for the first time. She could not make out the words through the wall, but she could hear the register of it, the sharp, angular quality of a man who has just understood that his cover is gone. Then Brooks's voice. Flat, final, a single sentence, then nothing. Walker and Emily looked at each other across the table. It's done, Walker said. Yes, Emily said. She let herself breathe. Hayes was in custody. The transmission was in evidence. The decryption was on the screen. 25 soldiers were alive and accounted for, and Sergeant Alvarez was in the medical center with a through and through that was going to heal in 6 weeks and a story he was going to tell for the rest of his life. It was done, except for the part that came next. The part Emily had been sitting across from ever since Brooks said a great deal is going to happen after today and had not finished the sentence. Brooks came back into the room at 11:12 hours. He sat down at the head of the table. He looked at Walker and then at Emily, and he put a folder on the table between them that had a classification marking on its cover that Emily recognized as 3 levels above her current clearance. There are things I need to tell you both, he said, and then there are decisions that will need to be made. Some of them yours, Carter, and some of them mine, and some of them above both our pay grades. Emily looked at the folder. She looked at the classification marking. She thought about 6 years of invisibility and 3 shots in a canyon at sunrise and a rifle her father built by hand and a promise she had made to her mother and broken in the best and most necessary way she knew how. She thought about Morrison from Ames, Iowa, who was alive today. She thought about Bennett, who had not run toward the Depression. She thought about 25 soldiers who had come home from Black Eagle Pass because one quiet woman had finally at the last possible moment stopped hiding what she was. Tell me, she said, and Brooks opened the folder. The folder Brooks opened contained 43 pages. Emily did not read all 43 pages in that room. Brooks walked her through the relevant sections page by page, with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the information he was delivering would require time to land correctly, and that rushing it would produce the wrong outcome. Walker sat across the table and said nothing, which Emily understood was its own form of support, the presence of someone who already knew some of what was in those pages and had chosen to be in the room when she heard it. The first thing Brooks told her was that Hayes had not been working alone. Not in the way Emily had imagined when she sat in the Humvee watching the mirror for 46 minutes. She had imagined one man, one motive, one foreign contact on the other end of an encrypted frequency. The reality inside that folder was considerably larger and considerably older than one morning in Black Eagle Pass. Hayes had been recruited 22 months ago, not by a foreign government in the conventional sense. By a network, Brooks used that word carefully, precisely the way he used all his words, a network that had been operating inside U.S. military logistics and communications infrastructure for an estimated 4 years. Hayes was one of 7 identified operatives. The investigation had been running for 8 months before this morning. Black Eagle Pass, Brooks said, was not the first operation this network enabled. It was the most aggressive, the most direct. He looked at Emily, and it was the first one that failed. Emily processed that. Because of me, she said. Because of you, Brooks confirmed. Walker made a sound that was not quite a word. Emily looked at him, and he was looking at the table with the expression of a man assembling a picture that kept getting larger than the frame he had prepared for it. 7 operatives, Walker said, inside our own structure. 7 confirmed, Brooks said. The network is larger. Hayes' transmission this morning gave us 3 new signal addresses we had not previously identified. The decryption is ongoing. He looked at both of them. This is why the arrest had to happen exactly as it did. The transmission was the thread. Hayes pulling on it gave us more of the network than 8 months of investigation had produced. Emily thought about the 4 minutes and 12 seconds in the equipment bay, about the decision to let him transmit, about what it had cost to sit at that maintenance panel and listen to a man who had tried to engineer her death compose his report on her survival. You needed him to send the message, she said. We needed him to send the message, Brooks said. And we needed someone in that bay who could give him enough time to complete it without triggering his suspicion. He paused. You gave us exactly enough time, Carter, not a minute more than necessary. Walker looked at her. You knew that was the play when you went in there. I figured it out on the way across the motor pool, Emily said. Another silence. The kind that accumulates when people are sitting with the full weight of what almost happened and what actually happened and the precise razor-thin margin between the two. Brooks turned to the next section of the folder. What he told her next was the thing Emily had not seen coming, the thing that changed the shape of the entire morning in a way she would spend days processing afterward. Hayes had known about her father, not about Emily, not about the training or the rifle or any of it, but Robert Carter, legendary civilian long-range marksman from Billings, Montana, had appeared in the network's intelligence files 18 months ago as part of a broader assessment of civilian precision shooting capability in the western United States. The assessment had been academic cataloging skill sets, identifying potential assets or threats, and Robert Carter's name had appeared with a notation that he was deceased and had no known successors in his craft. No known successors. Because Emily had never told anyone. Because Emily had spent 6 years being invisible. They assessed your father as a dead end, Brooks said. No legacy, no continuation. When they built a profile for this convoy, they had no intelligence on you beyond your official service record. He closed the folder. The invisibility you maintained as a personal choice inadvertently denied a sophisticated intelligence network, the one piece of information that would have changed everything about this morning's operation. Emily looked at the closed folder. She thought about 6 years. She thought about the weight of hiding the daily practice of making herself smaller than she was, the specific loneliness of being extraordinary in private. She had always understood the cost of invisibility as personal, what it cost her, what she gave up, what she refused to become. She had never once understood it as a strategic asset. Her invisibility had been the 5th wall of that canyon, the one the network had not calculated. They didn't know what they were walking into, she said. No, Brooks said. They knew the terrain, the timing, the route, the vehicle composition, the communications protocols, and the personnel roster. They did not know that the communications specialist in the third vehicle had spent 10 years learning to read terrain, calculate ballistics, and think like the people trying to kill her. He paused. That gap in their intelligence cost them 3 shooters in an 8-month espionage operation. Walker looked at Emily with an expression she had not seen on his face before and could not entirely name. "Your father," he said, "he never served." "No," she said. "But what he built in you," Walker said slowly, "functioned like a classified program, like something that took years and significant resources and a very specific vision to produce." He was quiet for a moment. He just did it in Montana on the weekends. Emily almost smiled. It was the truest thing anyone had said about her father in a long time. "He loved it," she said. "He loved all of it. The mathematics of it, the patience of it. He used to say that shooting well at distance was just listening to the world very carefully and responding to what it actually said instead of what you expected it to say." Walker looked at her for a long moment. "That's not a bad description of what you did this morning." "No," she said, "no, it's not." Brooks gave them a moment with that. Then he turned to the last section of the folder. "General Morrison," he said. Emily looked up. "General Michael Morrison, commanding officer of Fort Liberty, has been briefed on the events of this morning. He reviewed the preliminary action report, the counterintelligence findings, and my personal assessment of your role in both the firefight and the subsequent identification and capture of Hayes." Brooks looked at her steadily. "He wants to meet with you at 1500 hours today." Emily looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:31, 3 hours and 29 minutes. "What does he want?" she asked. "He has questions," Brooks said, "and he has something to offer. I am not authorized to tell you more than that until the meeting." Emily looked at Walker. Walker looked back at her with the expression of a man who knew more than he was saying and had made a decision to let Brooks run this correctly. "Is it something I should be worried about?" she asked. "No," Brooks said, and the way he said it, not reassuring, not dismissive, just flat and certain, was more convincing than any elaboration would have been. She spent the 3 hours and 29 minutes in the communications center. She completed the post-operation maintenance checks on all 4 primary radio systems. She filed her equipment report. She updated the frequency logs. She did everything that was on her standard checklist for a post-convoy duty day in order completely correctly. Not because she needed to calm herself down, because the work was real and it needed to be done, and she was in fact a communications specialist. And that had never stopped being true, even on the day she turned out to be something else as well. Morrison came to find her there at 14:47 hours, 13 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. He was not what Emily had expected from a general officer. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the build of a man who had once been physically imposing and had become something quieter and denser over the years, the way wood becomes denser as it ages. He came into the communications center without an aide and without announcement, and he looked around the room and found Emily at her bench, and he walked directly to her. "Specialist Carter," he said. "General Morrison," she said. She stood. He looked at her for a moment in the direct way of someone who is confirming what they expected to find. Then he sat down on the bench beside hers, uninvited, with the ease of a man who had never needed to be invited anywhere. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I read Brooks's report," he said. "Then I read Walker's preliminary. Then I called the medic who treated Alvarez because I wanted to understand the wound angle, and he told me that you had identified it as non-bone threatening before he had examined it." He paused. "Then I called the air support coordinator who spoke with Walker during the firefight because I wanted to understand the timeline. And he told me that at the time Walker called in the air support request, he was already reporting 3 shooters neutralized by an asset whose identity he did not disclose on the initial call." Another pause. "So I called Walker." "What did he tell you?" Emily said. "Everything," Morrison said, "including the part about the briefing room and the 6 years and the promise to your mother." He looked at her directly. "He told me about the promise to your mother." Emily sat with that. It was a specific discomfort having that private thing in the room with a general officer, and she sat with it honestly and did not try to manage it. "I understand that promise," Morrison said. "I understand what it cost you to make it and what it cost you to keep it and what it cost you to break it." He paused. "My own father made me promise something similar when I enlisted. He was a Korean War veteran, and he had seen things he never recovered from, and he made me promise I would never let the military make me into something I couldn't live with afterward." Emily looked at him. "I broke that promise too," Morrison said, in the Kunar province in 2007, in a situation not entirely unlike yours this morning, though the specifics were different. He was quiet for a moment. I think the promises we make to the people who love us when we are young and trying to protect them from being afraid are the most important promises we will ever make. And I think sometimes the most important promises are the ones we have to break in order to become who we were always supposed to be. The communications center was very quiet. Emily's hands were still on the bench beside her. She looked at them. I've thought about that a lot today, she said. I imagine you have, he said. Then he shifted, and the personal conversation closed the way conversations close when the person leading them decides it is time to move to the reason they came. I have something to ask you, Morrison said, and I want you to understand before I ask it that your answer will not affect your standing in this unit or your service record or anything about your immediate future except the one thing I'm about to describe. Ask, she said. Dr. Sarah Reynolds, he said. You know that name? Emily did not. She shook her head. She commands a precision assessment and long-range engagement program that has been running under joint authority for the last 3 years. It is not widely known. It is not widely discussed. It is the most advanced program of its kind in the U.S. military, and it produces a very small number of operational assets each year, assets who combine exceptional technical precision with the kind of judgment and situational analysis that cannot be trained in a standard sniper program. He looked at her. Reynolds has been looking for a specific type of person for 18 months. She has interviewed 41 candidates. She has selected none of them. Emily was very still. She read Brooks's report 40 minutes ago, Morrison said. She called me 11 minutes after she finished reading it. She used a word she has never in 3 years used about a candidate before. What word? Emily said. Morrison looked at her. Ready, he said. She said this one is already ready. The silence in the communications center had a different texture now. Emily looked at the radio equipment on the bench in front of her. The familiar weight of it, the 400 repetitions of the maintenance checklist, the 6 years of doing this one job correctly and completely, and without complaint, without expectation, without anyone knowing what else she was. She thought about Black Eagle Pass. She thought about 3 ridge lines and 3 shots and the specific silence after each one. She thought about her father's voice saying the hardest part isn't pulling the trigger. She thought about 25 soldiers. She thought about Morrison from Iowa who was going to write something in his notebook and wasn't sure yet what it would be. She thought about her mother. She thought about a promise made in the gold light of a Montana evening, made with love and fear in equal measure, by a woman who had seen her daughter's gift and been afraid of where it would lead. It had led here. It had led to exactly here. What would the program require? Emily asked. Morrison told her. It was 18 months of intensive assessment and training building on what she already had, adding the formal structure and tactical framework and team integration that her father's training had never included. It was a complete change of assignment, classification, and operational role. It was the end of being a communications specialist and the beginning of being something that did not have a simple title because the Army had not yet built enough of the title to have a common name for it. It was in every practical sense the thing she had been for 10 years in Montana and 6 years in the Army without anyone officially knowing it. Emily sat with all of that for a long moment. Then she asked the question she needed to ask. General Morrison, the 6 years I spent invisible, the 6 years where I had this capability and said nothing and filed radio equipment reports and sat in the back of briefing rooms, does that concern you? As a judgment question about who I am. Morrison looked at her steadily. No, he said. Why not? Because you spoke up when it mattered, he said. Not when it was safe, not when you had permission, when it mattered. With 25 lives on the line and no guarantee anyone would listen, you got on the radio and you said, stop them right now, and you were correct. He paused. The Army is full of people who speak up when it's safe. I am not interested in those people for this program. I'm interested in the person who waited until the moment demanded it and then gave everything they had. Emily thought about the radio, the moment before she pressed the transmit button, the fraction of a second where she had almost let it go, almost stayed silent, almost remained the woman nobody noticed for one more day. She pressed it. She had pressed it. The hardest part, she said quietly, almost to herself, isn't pulling the trigger. Morrison heard her. What is the hardest part? He asked. She looked at him, finding the courage to speak before anyone has to. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Where did you hear that?" "My father said it," she said, "a long time ago. I didn't understand what he meant until this morning." Morrison sat with that the way a man sits with something that has arrived exactly as it should. At 15:31 hours, General Morrison left the communications center. He had her answer. Emily sat alone for 7 minutes after he left. She sat at her bench in the communications center, where she had spent a significant portion of 6 years being invisible, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day. Not just the firefight, not just Hayes in the equipment bay and the 43-page folder. All of it, including the parts that had no official name, the grief of the promise she had broken, the complicated relief of it, the exhaustion of a day that had started before sunrise in a canyon with 3 snipers on the ridgelines and was ending here in this room with a general officer saying the word ready about her. Her father's rifle was in the case beside her bench. She put her hand on it. She did not open it. She just rested her palm on the top of the case and felt the familiar weight of it and thought about Robert Carter of Billings, Montana, who had died at 59 without knowing that everything he had built into his daughter would one day matter in a way that neither of them could have predicted on any of those Tuesday afternoons when the light went gold across the hills. He had known she was the most naturally gifted shooter he had ever seen. He had not known she would use it to save 25 people. He had not known about the mole, or the network, or the 8-month investigation, or the 43 pages in a classified folder, or Dr. Sarah Reynolds, who had spent 18 months looking for someone who was already ready. He had just known his daughter. He had taught her everything he had. And then he had died and left her alone with it, and she had done what she thought was right and made a promise she thought was honorable and kept it for 6 years. And this morning the world had required something different from her, and she had reached into herself and found that the 10 years of Tuesday afternoons were still there, every single one of them, not a gram lighter than the day he put them into her. The door to the communications center opened. Morrison was not the only one who had not made her come to him. Walker came in and sat down across from her, the way he had sat across from her at the long table after Hayes' arrest, with the directness of an officer who had decided that the transactional version of this conversation was not the appropriate one. "How are you?" he asked. The human question again. "Different," she said. "Honestly." He nodded. He understood that. "Morrison tell you about Reynolds?" he said. "Yes." And I said yes. Walker looked at her. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. Not quite pride, he had not known her long enough for that to be exactly the right word. Something adjacent to pride. The expression of a person who has watched something happen that they know they will remember for the rest of their life and are already beginning to understand why. "Good," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Walker said, "Carter, I owe you something." She looked at him. "You don't?" "I do," he said. "The briefing room. The culture we create where the radio girl sits in the back and nobody asks her what she sees on the map." He was looking at the floor. "I ran that briefing. I set that culture. I have been setting it for 14 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I am going to run my next briefing differently." Emily looked at him. "You already told me that," she said. "You said I sit in the front." "I did say that," he said. "That was enough," she said. He looked up at her. "Was it?" She thought about it honestly. "It was a good start," she said. He almost smiled. Then the almost became real brief, genuine. "Morrison told me something else," Walker said, "about Hayes' network. The decryption of this morning's transmission identified a third contact that had not appeared in any previous intelligence. A contact with access to personnel assignment records." He paused. "Brooks believes this contact was responsible for initially flagging your deployment as a low-risk communications asset, making sure you were assigned to convoy duty, making sure you were in the third vehicle." Emily went very still. "Hayes didn't put me in that vehicle because of a tactical recommendation," she said slowly. "Someone with access to personnel records placed me there. We don't know yet if it was intentional targeting of you specifically or coincidental placement based on role assignment," Walker said. "But the investigation is going to find out." Emily sat with that. The idea that her placement in the convoy might have been deliberate, not because someone knew who she was, but because someone was systematically positioning certain personnel types in certain vehicles to maximize casualties, was a different kind of cold than anything she had felt in the canyon. It meant the network was more sophisticated than even the 43 pages suggested. It meant the investigation that Brooks was running was not close to over. It meant that this morning, which had felt like a conclusion, was actually a beginning. "Brooks is going to want to talk to you again," Walker said. "I know," she said. "Reynolds too, as soon as Morrison clears the formal assignment." "I know that too. And there will be a formal commendation process. It's going to get attention." Emily looked at the rifle case under her hand. She thought about Invisible. She thought about the specific practiced art of being the person nobody looked at twice. She thought about how good she had been at it, how long she had maintained it, how much of herself she had folded into that maintenance. She thought about Morrison from Iowa in his green notebook. She thought about Bennett alive. She thought about Alvarez through and through, non-life-threatening, 6 weeks, and he was back. She thought about 25. The number had a weight to it that she had not let herself fully feel until right now, in this quiet room at the end of the longest day of her life. 25 people who were going home. 25 people who were going to have dinner tonight and call their families and sleep in their bunks and wake up tomorrow with the ordinary and extraordinary gift of another day, because one quiet woman in the back of a briefing room had been unable at the last possible moment to stay quiet. "The attention is going to be uncomfortable," she said. "Yes," Walker said. "I'm going to manage it," she said. "I know," Walker said. And the certainty in his voice was clean and unqualified, and she received it the way you receive a thing that is simply true. She picked up the rifle case. She stood. Walker stood with her, the automatic courtesy of a man who understood that the moment called for it, and they stood in the communications center where Emily Carter had spent a significant portion of 6 years and looked at each other across the specific and irreversible distance of a morning that had changed everything. "Next briefing," Walker said. "Front row," Emily said. Lee. She walked out of the communications center and into the Fort Liberty afternoon, and the light hit her differently than it had that morning. Or maybe she was just allowing herself to stand in it differently, and she carried her father's rifle in its case at her side, and she walked through the base with the upright, unhurried certainty of a woman who had spent 6 years practicing invisibility and was done practicing it. 2 weeks later, she met Dr. Sarah Reynolds. Reynolds was 47, direct with the kind of economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of precision, and she looked at Emily across a table in a secure facility, and she said, "I've read everything. Tell me something the files don't say." Emily thought for a moment. Then she said, "My father taught me that the hardest part isn't pulling the trigger. The hardest part is finding the courage to speak before anyone has to." Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. "And did you find it?" Reynolds asked. "Yes," Emily said, "eventually." "How long did it take?" 6 years, Emily said. "In about 3 seconds. Reynolds was quiet. Then she said, "That's the most honest answer anyone has given me in 18 months of interviews." She extended her hand across the table. Emily took it. 3 months later, General Morrison stood at a podium in front of the assembled personnel of Fort Liberty, and he read the citation for one of the Army's highest battlefield commendations. He read every word of it, the ambush, the 3 shots, the mole, the transmission, the network, and the room was so quiet during the reading that the words seemed to settle into the walls and stay there. When he finished, he looked out at the assembled soldiers. "This commendation," he said, "is not for a sniper. It is not for an intelligence officer. It is not for a hero in any of the standard definitions of that word." He paused. "It is for a communications specialist who sat in the back of a briefing room for 6 years and saw everything and said nothing, and who chose at the moment it cost the most to speak, to be seen, to offer everything she had been hiding to the people who needed it most." He looked at Emily standing at attention in the front row. "The easiest thing that she could have done," Morrison said, "was stay invisible. The bravest thing she did was refuse to." Emily Carter stood in the front row of that auditorium in Fort Liberty and received her commendation and did not cry because her father had taught her to breathe through moments that threatened to undo you. And she breathed through this one steadily all the way down. And somewhere in that breathing was the gold afternoon light of a Montana hillside and the weight of a custom rifle across her forearms and the voice of a man who loved her telling her that the world would one day ask her for everything she had. She had given it, every quiet, hidden, faithful, extraordinary piece of it. and 25 soldiers were alive to prove it.